Hey everyone, today we are covering the story of two Imperial breachers who are defending an Imperial ship full of refugees escaping a war zone as it is breached and boarded in space by the forces of Khorne, the Blood God. Their main priority is defending the navigator so that they can plot a safe route through the warp, but to get there they need to cross a large portion of the ship, and it is not an easy journey. Hopefully you enjoy. I really enjoyed this one. I enjoyed making it, and I really like the characters after having created the video. So I might make them into a series in a similar way as the characters from Tyrannid's Bane. As always, before we begin, I'd like to say a massive thank you to our supporters, both our patrons and our YouTube members, who kindly help keep this content going. If you'd like to become a patron, you can find a link in the description below. Or if you'd like to become a channel member, you can find a link on the channel homepage. And if you'd like to listen to audio only, you can find the Lawkeeper's Librarium on Spotify.
In the small hours of that watch, when the great ship had settled into the quiet that passes for night in a vessel that never truly sleeps, there were 11 men gathered about a table in the guards' quarters, and 2 of them were playing cards while the rest looked on and offered the kind of advice that is never asked for and never heeded. The 2 who played had played together for a very long time. This was plain to anyone who watched them for even a little while, though neither of them would have thought to say so aloud, for the things that lie deepest between old companions are seldom spoken and never explained. One of them was named Oban Yanak, a broad and unhurried man who counted things: the coins in the pot, the chits laid down, the buttons and the odds and the small worn tokens that stood in for wealth aboard a ship where true wealth had long ago ceased to mean very much, and he counted them under his breath in a low murmur that the others had grown so used to that they no longer heard it at all, the way one ceases to hear the sea after living long beside it. And the other was named Seneca Agora, a quieter man and a leaner one, who before he laid down any card at all would draw a single slow breath and hold it a moment, as though gathering himself, and each small choice deserved to be met with a settled mind. It was a habit so much a part of him that he had long since forgotten he possessed it. But Oban had not forgotten, for Oban forgot nothing, and when Seneca drew that breath and set down his card, Oban only smiled a little to himself and said that his friend was bluffing. And he was right, for he was very often right about Seneca, as a man may be right about the weather of a country he has lived in all his days. "He has nothing worth the having," said Oban, and turned over his own hand, and began drawing the little heap of winnings toward himself across the scarred and ancient metal of the tabletop. He counted them as they came to him, each one aloud and contented. There was laughter at this, soft and worn and kindly, the laughter of men who possessed almost nothing and had learned across long years to be open-handed with the little that remained to them. And it is worth pausing here to say something of who these men were and how they had come to be sitting at that table, so far from any world, in the belly of a ship crossing a sea of the warp. For their story is a small one, as the histories of the great and terrible age they lived in are reckoned, and small stories have a way of being forgotten if no one troubles to tell them. The ship was called the Mater Dolorosa, which is to say the Mother of Sorrows, and she was old, a great hauling vessel of more than 3 kilometers from stem to stern, built in some yard whose name had passed out of memory, refitted 100 times over the long centuries until little of her first making remained. She was the foremost of 9 ships that fled together through the dark, and that little fleet had a name too, murmured with more hope than pride by those aboard: the Exodus, for they were a people in flight. They had come from a world called Attica Secundus, a vast hive of teeming billions, and something had risen up out of the deep places of that world, a madness with a god behind it, red-handed and hungry for slaughter, and it had swept over the hives and the spaceports and drowned them one by one in blood, until the only mercy left to the people of Attica was to run. And so they had run. 9 ships were what could be filled and flung skyward before the ports fell silent. A few 100,000 souls were what those ships could carry, out of the billions who had lived and toiled and dreamed beneath the spires. Everyone aboard the Mater Dolorosa had left someone behind in the burning. Most of them had left more than they had brought. That grief lay upon the ship like a dampness in her walls, seeping into the recycled air and into the long silences, and it never wholly went away. They were bound for a place called Sanctorum Ves, which lay 11 days ahead of them through the warp, if the navigator held true to the road he cut, and the ancient reactors did not fail, and nothing else came apart that could not be lashed together again. It was no haven they steered toward, and none of them pretended otherwise. Ves was a muster world, a great grinding intake of the Imperium's war machine, and those who came to it were sorted as a miller sorts grain, the strong set to labor or handed weapons and sent to fight, the children taken away to be raised into servants of the throne. It was not safety. Not one of the men at the table would have shamed the word by using it. But it was not death, and it was not the endless dark of the warp, and that was reason enough to steer toward it and call the steering hope. They say the water's gone bad in the 6th hold, offered one of the watchers, reaching as tired men will for a small trouble to lay over a great one. Everything's gone bad in the lower holds, said another, and he shook his head slowly. Half rations since the 3rd day, and children crying for want of food, and their mothers with nothing to answer them but a soft lie. I stood a watch down there, and I'll not stand another if there's any way round it. It isn't the smell, though the smell is a hard thing. It's that you can hear the old ship straining under it all. She groans in the night. She is old, said Seneca, and she is filled far past any measure her builders drew for her, so of course she groans. He turned the fallen card idly in his fingers as he spoke, and the others listened. For when Seneca spoke of the ship, they always listened. He knew her as a man knows an old house he has lived in half his life, by her every creak and sigh and settling timber. She carries 48,000 souls in holds that were meant to hold ore, with one of her 3 hearts gone cold. A ship in that state is bound to complain, and I, for one, am glad to hear it, for it means she is still speaking to us and still bearing up. It is the day she falls silent that I should fear. A cheerful man is Seneca, said one of them. He is cheerful once you come to know him, said Oban, gathering in the last of the pot. It takes about 10 years. And Seneca might have made some small answer to that, one of the worn and easy jests that passed between the two of them, and carried, folded up inside, all the weight of the things that such men never say plainly. But the answer was still unspoken in him, the breath of it only half drawn, when the ship was struck. It was felt before it was heard. Up through the deck it came, like a hammer drum to the side of the hull, into the soles of their boots and the bones of their legs, a single vast and jarring blow somewhere forward and below, so deep and so wrong, that for the space of half a breath not one man moved or spoke, but only sat and felt it, as a man will sit in the moment after he has been badly wounded and before the hurt arrives, when the body has understood a thing that the mind has not yet been told. Seneca knew every voice the ship possessed, and this was none of them. It was not the coughing of a plasma conduit, nor the shriek of a failing gravity plate, nor that long, slow groan. This was a sound that came from outside, and there ought to have been no outside, not here, not in the deep of the warp, where the ship swam alone through the dark. This was the sound of something enormous driving an iron prow through her outer hull and biting down and holding fast, the way a hound seizes and will not let go. The cards were still drifting to their rest upon the table when the second blow fell. It came nearer than the first, off to the port side and further forward, closer to the spire where the navigator sat at his sacred and solitary labor, and the deck leapt beneath them, hard enough to send the winnings skittering across the metal, and a small cracked lighter spinning away over the edge to the floor, where no one watched it fall. And then the ship found her own voice at last and began to cry out, a hard, flat, repeating note that most of them had heard only in drills, and the lumens overhead woke and turned from grey to a deep and pulsing crimson, so that every face about the table was washed in the colour of alarm. There was a standing order for this. Every man who bunked in those quarters knew it as he knew his own name, for the guards' quarters lay close against the navigator's spire by design, and the men who slept there were the last hard shell about the most precious soul aboard the ship. If ever we are boarded, you will go to the spire, whatever else is burning and whatever else is screaming, and you will hold the doors. No one had ever had to. Boarding in the warp was a thing that happened in other men's tales, told at other men's tables aboard ships that were now only wreckage and prayer. And yet here we are. Oban rose. He did not scramble nor lunge, but came up from the bench with the slow, sure movement of a man who has already decided what must be done, and now means only to do it. And his hand was moving toward the arming lockers before he was fully standing, and when he spoke, his voice was level and quiet and empty of all fear, which was in its way more dreadful than any shout could have been. To the spire, he said, and the third blow fell. Now it is a strange and telling thing about men who have practiced a hard craft for a long time, that fear does not make them faster. It makes them slower, rather, or seems to, for where a frightened man will snatch and fumble and do a thing 3 times in his haste to do it once, a man who has truly mastered his trade will do it only once and calmly, and be finished while the others are still grasping. And so it was that, in those first moments after the third blow fell, while the younger armsmen scrambled and cursed and dropped things in the crimson alarm light, Oban and Seneca went to the arming lockers and made themselves ready for war with the unhurried fluidity of 2 craftsmen sitting down to a familiar bench. Oban took down his shield first, as he always did, for the shield was the heart of everything he was. It was a great slab of plasteel faced with ceramite, scarred and pitted by more years of use than its bearer cared to count, and it stood very nearly half his height. A lesser man would have had an effort to lift it, and a lesser man would not have known what to do with it once it was lifted. Oban settled it onto his arm, the way another man might settle a well-worn coat about his shoulders, feeling for the old familiar balance of it, and something in him seemed to grow quieter and more certain the moment its weight came home. Then he took up his revolver, a heavy blunt-nosed thing that fired 6 rounds and no more, and he loaded it without once looking down at his hands. He had loaded it 10,000 times in the dark and in the light, and in places worse than either, and his fingers knew the work as a blind man's fingers know the letters of a braille page he has read all his life. 6 rounds, seated one by one, each with a small final click, and all the while his lips moved in that same low murmur, counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and the doors between here and the spire, and the men in the room, and the seconds since the first blow fell. Seneca's kit was a different sort of thing, for Seneca was a different sort of soldier. Where Oban carried the means to stop an enemy and hold a place, Seneca carried the means to change the very shape of the ground he fought upon. He took up his shotgun a short and brutal naval weapon made for the close and terrible work of fighting in corridors, and slung it. And then he began, with the same settled care, to gather the rest. There was the melter cutter that could open a sealed door, or a sealed man with equal ease. There were the demolition charges, wrapped and stowed with a tenderness that would have surprised anyone who did not understand them. There were grenades, and breaching tools, and coils of cord, and lengths of strong strap bound tight and tucked away against some need not yet known. A soldier's habit, that the carrying of cord and strap against the day when something must be bound, or braced, or held together, that was never meant to come apart. He drew one long, slow breath before he closed the locker, the way he did before any labor of consequence, and let it out, and was ready. All the while the vox was a storm of broken voices in their ears. It came in fragments, each one worse than the last, painting between them a picture that no single voice could have borne to paint whole. Strikes all along the bow, the enemy through the hull in a dozen places at once, this corridor lost, and that junction cut off, and a whole watch section gone silent and not answering. There was no front to this battle, no line drawn upon a map that a man might stand behind. The enemy was simply inside, everywhere and all at once, and the ship's few defenders were being broken apart into small islands of the living amid a rising dark. And then, cutting through the chaos, cold and clear as a bell rung in a burning house, came the command net, and it named the one thing that mattered above all others. The spire must hold. The navigator must live and finish his work and carry the ship through, or else the Mater Dolorosa, and every soul aboard her, and the 8 ships that followed her through the dark, would be lost forever to the sea of souls. Hold the spire, or lose the fleet. And so the standing order that Oban and Seneca had carried, half forgotten for so many years, and the desperate need of 200,000 living souls, became, in that instant, one and the same thing. The 2 men looked at one another. Nothing needed saying, and so nothing was said. They stepped out into the corridor, and the corridor told them at once what kind of night this was going to be. It had already been fought over. The fighting had passed through here only minutes before, and moved on. And it had left its marks behind, armsmen of the ship's own complement, lying where they had fallen. Men whom Seneca half knew by their faces, sprawled in the ungainly attitudes that the dead never choose for themselves, and the living can never quite forget. There was blood on the deck, and blood up the walls, and there was the smell of it, thick and coppery and close, mingled with the sharper reeks of scorched metal and spent powder, and the terrible intimate smell of men laid open. The younger armsmen who came out behind them faltered at the sight, and one of them made a small sound, and Seneca did not blame him for it. There is no drill that can prepare a man for the smell of a place where his friends have just been killed. And then, out of the depths of the ship, there came a new sound, one that none of them had ever heard before, though they would all come to know it far too well before that night was done. It was a horn, a long, low, droning note of brass, vast and slow and somehow gloating, rolling up through the decks and the bulkheads and the bones of the ship until it seemed to sound inside their own chests. There was nothing of the Imperium in it, nothing of any honest trumpet that ever called men to muster or to prayer. It was the voice of the thing that had come for them, the war horn of the brazen tithe of corn, sounding out across the ship it had chosen to devour, marking the rhythm of its own slaughter. In the days to come, and there would be days, though none of them yet knew it, the survivors would learn to dread that droning note above all other sounds, for it came before each fresh assault, the way thunder comes before the storm, and to hear it was to know that more killing was on its way. But they did not know that yet. They knew only that it was dreadful, and that it was near, and that between them and the spire lay a stretch of corridor from which the sounds of screaming had not stopped. Oban set his shield, Seneca drew his breath, and around the bend ahead of them, red in the red light, the enemy came. They came screaming, and it was the screaming that told Seneca the worst of it before ever he saw their faces. For he had heard that particular note before, long ago, and he had hoped never to hear it again. There is a way that men cry out when they have gone past the far edge of themselves, and something else has come in to fill the space they left behind, and it is not like the war cry of an honest soldier, which for all its fury is still the sound of a man. This was not the sound of men, and yet the thing that turned in Seneca's chest like a knife was the first of them rounding the bend into the red light. They wore the clothes of men, and poor clothes at that, the drab and shapeless coveralls of hive workers, and the patched jackets and worn boots of the lower holds. They were Attican refugees. They were the very people the Mater Dolorosa had been sent to carry to safety, the people who had been left behind as the ships escaped the planet's surface before being lost to the enemy. Now they had turned to chaos, had followed the Exodus fleet, and had boarded them in the name of the blood god. With the 8-pointed star daubed in blood and filth upon their brows, howling for slaughter in a tongue that had once been human speech, Oban planted his shield. He set the great scarred slab of it down across the width of the corridor, and set his shoulder behind it, and became, in that instant, a thing that could not be moved, a door in the shape of a man, closing the passage as surely as any bulkhead. The first of the cultists broke upon that shield, the way a wave breaks upon a rock, and went nowhere, and the second and the third piled up behind, and still the shield did not give, for behind it stood Oban, and behind Oban stood 10 years of knowing exactly how to stand. And Seneca worked around him. This was the shape of the thing they did together, the shape they had worn into their bones across 100 fights on a dozen worlds. Oban was the fixed point, and Seneca was the moving one. Oban held, and Seneca ranged, and neither of them ever had to look to see where the other was, for each of them always knew. When the press of bodies against the shield grew too great, Seneca's shotgun spoke over Oban's shoulder into the thick of them, short and loud and final, and cleared a breathing space. When one of the cultists slipped along the wall and around the shield's edge, thinking to come at them from the side, Oban's revolver was there to meet him. One deliberate round, and the man fell. And through it all, beneath the screaming and the roar of the shotgun and the crack of the revolver, Oban counted. 5, he said as the man dropped by the wall. Not loudly, just a low, steady marking, the same murmur he used over a card table, so that Seneca always knew without asking how many rounds his friend had left before the slow work of reloading must begin. 4. They were not alone in that corridor. A knot of the ship's own armsmen came up behind them, sent by some order or some instinct toward the sound of the fighting. And they were young. Seneca saw that at once. Young and half-trained, and utterly unready for what they had walked into. They came around the corner, and they saw the dead, and they saw the howling star-marked things that had until recently been men like themselves, and they froze. Every one of them froze, weapons half-raised, faces gone slack and grey, caught in that terrible stillness that takes hold of a soldier. The first time the world asks more of him than he knew he had. There was no time to be gentle, and so Oban was not gentle, but neither was he cruel. "You," he said, not turning his head, his voice cutting flat and certain through their panic. "The 3 of you. That side passage there. Hold it. Nothing comes through it. You don't advance, you don't chase. You hold that angle, and you shoot anything that isn't us. Do you hear me? Hold the angle." and such was the authority in that level voice, the sheer unhurried certainty of a man who plainly knew what he was about, that they did hear him, and they moved, and for a little while they held. For a while it held, and time in a fight like that one is a currency beyond price. It let Oban reload 6 fresh rounds seated by feel, while Seneca's shotgun held the front, and it kept the side passage from opening at their backs, while the worst of the rush spent itself against the shield. But it could not be bought without cost, and the cost was paid by the young men. When the surge came at the side passage, the green armsmen were not ready for its fury, and though they fired, and though many cultists fell to their fire, the tide came over them all the same. Seneca saw it happen from the corner of his eye, in the way a man sees the worst things, sidelong and helpless, saw them go down one after another in that narrow space. The whole knot of them, boys who had been alive and frightened a half-minute before, and were now simply part of the terrible leavings of the corridor. Only one of them came staggering back to Oban and Seneca. The rest did not. In front of Oban, the cultists had thinned to only a few, allowing Seneca to support the lone survivor and help him clear the remaining bodies, throwing themselves at the defenders. There was no time to grieve the fallen, and Seneca did not try. Grief was a thing you carried out of a place like this and unpacked later in the quiet, if you were fortunate enough to reach the quiet. But he marked them. He always marked them. Somewhere in the settled place behind his sternum, he set down the count of the dead the way Oban set down the count of his rounds, and he knew that the number would only grow before the night was through, and he knew that he would carry every one of them. "Clear," said Oban at last, as the corridor emptied of the living, and only the dead, and the 2 of them, and the one surviving boy remained. He was already looking forward, toward the spire, toward the work still undone. And it was then, in that first small silence, that Seneca felt it come up through the soles of his boots and into the bones of his legs, as the first blow had come, but slower now, and steadier, and without any wrongness in it at all. A deep low thrum in the deck plates, patient as a great heart beating far off, so faint that a man not listening for it would never have known it was there. But Seneca was always listening to the ship, and he knew her every voice, and he understood at once what this one was. It was the navigator, somewhere forward and above, in his high and solitary chamber. Massinoma Vast had bent his whole will to the cutting of the road, and the ship was beginning, only beginning, to answer him. The translation had started. Somewhere ahead of them, still hours off and beyond all seeing, lay the moment when the Mater Dolorosa would gather herself and leap and be gone from this place, and every soul who yet lived aboard her would be carried through into the light. They could not see that moment. They had no clock to count it down, no dial to watch, nothing but that faint deepening thrum beneath their feet to tell them it was coming at all. But it was coming, and between now and then, there was only one thing in all the world that they were required to do, one thing that was suddenly the whole of their war and the whole of their purpose. They had to hold long enough, and the ship herself would end this. Hold long enough, and the thrum would rise to its fullness and carry them out of reach of the horn and the star and the howling dark. That was all. That was everything. Oban lifted his shield from the deck and settled it once more upon his arm. The way forward would not be easy, for they hear the gunshots and fighting ahead of them. Ahead of them, the corridor opened out toward a wide crossing of ways, the wardroom junction, where 4 passages met beneath a high, vaulted Gothic ceiling, and the sounds that came rolling back from it were the sounds of a great fight already joined, gunfire and shouting, and beneath it, droning, the brazen horn. There was no way onwards to the spire but through that crossing. There never is, in tales such as this one, any road to where you must go except the hard one. Seneca drew his breath. Then the two of them went forward together, joined by the boy, toward the junction and the noise, and whatever waited in the red light beyond, because moving forward was the job, and because the ship was counting on them. The wardroom junction was a great meeting of ways, 4 broad corridors coming together beneath a high vaulted ceiling into a space wide enough that a man standing at its center might have thrown a stone and struck no wall. In gentler days, it had been a place of passage and small commerce, where off-duty crew crossed paths and paused to trade words and rumor beneath the flickering lumens. There was still a long counter along one side, where an engineer's mate had once dispensed recaf and grievances in equal measure. Now it was a killing floor, and Seneca understood, the moment they came to the edge of it, that everything before this had been only the rough beginning of the night, and that here the true measure of the enemy would first be taken. For the things fighting in the junction were not cultists. Seneca saw that at once, and the seeing of it settled cold in his stomach. These were soldiers. They moved, as soldiers move, in pairs and in fire teams, one rising while another covered, flowing from cover to cover with the economy of long training. And they wore the heavy gear of boarding troops, plated and sealed, carrying the short, brutal weapons, made for exactly this kind of close and desperate work. Somewhere, on some fallen world or lost ship, these men had been drilled as hard as any armsmen of the Imperial Navy, and then they had turned, or been turned, and given themselves over to the thing whose horn now droned through the hull. They were traitors, and worse than traitors, they were competent, and competence in the service of that red god was a far more terrible thing than any amount of howling madness. They had pinned a knot of defenders against the recaf counter and the mouth of the corridor beyond it. A proper Navy breacher team, Seneca saw, real soldiers of the ship's own complement, perhaps a dozen of them, fighting well and losing slowly. At their head was a young officer, a sub-lieutenant by the markings on his battered plate, and he was doing everything rightly, holding his men together, husbanding their fire, and calling his shots in a voice that had not yet cracked, though it plainly wanted to. But there is only so long that a dozen good men can hold a bad position against an enemy who knows his business. And the traitors knew theirs, and were working patiently to flank the counter and end it. Oban and Seneca did not rush in to save them. That is a thing that happens in the poorer sort of tale, where the heroes arrive and sweep all before them, and the men they find already fighting become mere onlookers to their glory. But it is not how it happens in the real world, and it was not how it happened here. Oban and Seneca came into that fight the way two skilled hands come to a work already begun by others. They found the shape of it, and found where they were needed, and slotted themselves into the gaps without a word, wasted on introduction or command. The boy did the same, and fell in under the command of the lieutenant. The young officer's eyes found them across the din, and marked the shield and the shotgun, and the unhurried way the two of them moved, and understood in an instant that help had come, and that it was help worth having. He gave them a curt nod, no more, and shifted his men a little to make room, and that was the whole of the parley between them. Professionals knowing, professionals, near equals meeting in the one place where a man's quality is proven past all argument. There was no time for more, and no need of it. Later Seneca would learn that the officer was named Carrick Wen. But the junction was bad ground, and Oban knew it, and Seneca knew that Oban knew it. For all the shield's power, it was a thing made for corridors, for choke points and doorways, and narrow places where one immovable man could close away. Here in the wide open crossing, There was no such place. The enemy had room to spread and to flank, room to come at them from 3 sides at once, and against that openness, the shield was only a shield and not a fortress. If they fought here on the enemy's terms, in the ground the enemy had chosen, they would fight well, and they would still, in the end, be overwhelmed. Seneca saw all this in a single sweeping glance, the way he saw such things, not shot by shot, but as a whole, with the room and its walls and its weaknesses laid out before him like a map. And he understood what had to be done. The ground was wrong, so he would change the ground. There was a bulkhead along the junction's northern wall, a great support member where the ceiling's weight came down, and above it and behind it lay the tangle of the corridor's upper structure. Seneca had served on 3 ships of this class, and he knew their bones. He knew where they were strong and where they were merely stubborn, and he knew that if that member came down, it would bring a good part of the ceiling with it and choke the northern approach entirely. It would take 3 of the 4 ways the enemy had to come at them and close them to 1. It would make a choke point where there had been none. It would make, out of this wide, bad ground, a valley. He told Oban with a look, and Oban told him yes, with less than that. And then Seneca went to his work. He crossed the northern wall low and fast, while the breacher team and Oban's revolver bought him the cover and seconds he needed. And he set his charges against the base of the member with hands that did not hurry even now, placing each one where it would do the most and the surest work. It was fine and particular labor, the kind that cannot be rushed however loud the world grows around a man. And when the last charge was set, and the leads were run, and there was nothing left but the doing of it, Seneca paused. He drew one long, slow breath, and held it, and let the whole roaring junction fall away from him, until there was nothing in all the world but the charge and the wall, and the thing he meant to do to them. Then he let the breath go, and he blew the bulkhead. The sound of it was enormous, a great tearing thunderclap that swallowed all the lesser noise of the fight, and the northern quarter of the ceiling came down in a roaring cataract of plasteel and dust and severed cabling. When the dust began to settle, the junction had changed its shape entirely. 3 of the 4 approaches were gone, choked with tangled wreckage. Only one narrow way remained open by which the enemy might still come at them, and it was scarcely wider than a corridor. It was a choke point. It was, at last, ground on which they could rule. And now the fight became a different thing. The traitors, robbed of their corridors to flank and funneled into the one open way, had to come on straight into the teeth of everything the defenders had, into Oban's shield planted square behind the gap, into Seneca's shotgun and the breacher team's massed fire, and into a killing ground of the defenders' own making. It was hard work still, and bloody, for the traitors were brave in their corrupted way, and skilled to the last, and they did not break easily. But they could not win now. The ground had been taken from them, and a soldier who has lost the ground has lost far more than he yet knows. One by one the traitor squad fell in that narrow gap, until the last of them went down before the counter, and the guns fell silent, and there was, for one moment, only the ringing quiet that comes after a great noise, and the settling of the dust, and the ragged breathing of men who had lived through a thing they had not expected to live through. It had been a good fight, and a clean win, as such things are reckoned, and won together, the shield and the shotgun, and the young officer's steady team, all bound into one effort greater than the sum of them. Seneca felt it, that small, hard satisfaction of a difficult thing, done well and done in good company, and he saw the same on the faces of Wen's surviving men, the beginning of something that, in another few minutes, might even have become relief. Then the tone of the night dropped through the floor. There was a sound from beyond the one open way, past the fallen dead, a heavy sound, slow and deliberate, and terribly unhurried, the tread of something that felt no need to hurry because it feared nothing in all the world that might be waiting for it. The dust stirred in the gap, and out of the murk, ducking its vast helmed head beneath the broken ceiling, stepping over the tangled corpses of the traitor squad as a man steps over a fallen branch in the road, came a giant in armor the color of old blood. Seneca had never seen one before. He had only heard of them in the way one hears of dragons, spoken of by men who had themselves only heard of them. A rumor of ruin passed hand to hand until it hardly seemed a thing of the real world at all. But he knew it for what it was the instant he laid eyes upon it, and he felt the knowledge go through the whole junction like a cold wind, felt the small hard satisfaction of a moment before turn to ash, and felt every man there understand in the same breath that everything they had just done, all of it, the whole desperate winning of that fight, had been merely the easy part. A Chaos Space Marine had come to the wardroom junction, and it had come for the same door they had. It is one thing to be told of a giant, and another thing entirely to stand in a room with one, and Seneca understood in the first moment that no telling could ever have made him ready. The thing that came through the gap was made in the shape of a man, and that was somehow the worst of it, for the shape only threw into more terrible relief everything about it that was not a man at all. It stood half again as tall as Oban, who was not a small man, and it was broad, armored head to foot in ceramite, the deep dried color of old blood, and it moved with a dreadful wrongness, not the lumbering gait that so vast a bulk ought to have owned, but something smooth and swift and horribly certain, as though its great weight cost it nothing at all. There were skulls hammered into its armor, and the 8-pointed star, and other marks that Seneca's eye slid away from, because some part of him understood that to look too long at them was itself a kind of wound. It carried a blade in one fist, longer than a man's leg, and it did not hurry, and it was not afraid, and it looked upon the room full of soldiers who had just won their hard-fought victory, the way a man might look upon a field of standing corn that wanted cutting. Oban did the bravest thing Seneca ever saw him do, which was to charge it. He knew, they both knew, that there is a thing a shield man can do against a single foe, however large, which is to strike him at the run with the whole weight of shield and body and shoulder behind it, and knock him from his feet, and so buy the half-second in which a downed enemy may be finished. It is a hard thing and a chancy thing, even against an ordinary foe, and Oban had done it 100 times and lived. So he set his shoulder to the great scarred slab of his shield, and he ran at the giant with everything that was in him, and he struck it square, and it was like a man running at the flank of a moving tank. The Marine did not fall, it did not stagger. It rocked back perhaps half a pace, and looked down, almost curious, at the thing that had struck it, and then it swept its armored arm across, and sent Oban and his shield, and all his charging weight, tumbling away across the deck like a child's toy kicked aside, and Seneca's heart stopped in his chest until he saw his friend roll and come up, shaken, alive, the shield taking the impact. And then the killing began in earnest, and it was nothing like a fight. A fight is a thing between matched foes, a trading of blows and chances. This was not that. This was slaughter given the shape of grace. One of Wen's breeches fired into the giant's chest at 3 paces, and the rounds sparked and skittered off the ancient plate, and the Marine took the man's head from his shoulders with a single backhand blow that seemed almost lazy, almost an afterthought, and had already turned to the next before the first had finished falling. Another it caught in one vast fist and broke against the recaf counter, once, and let fall. It moved through the room as a scythe moves through a field, and men died at every step of it. Good men, trained men, men who had lived through the traitor squad only to meet this, and there was nothing any single one of them could do to so much as slow it. No one weapon could pierce it. No single blow could fell it. It could not be stopped by any means that any one man there possessed. So they did the only thing that could be done, which was to stop being many men and become for a few dreadful moments one single desperate effort. It was Wen who bound them into it, the young officer's cracking voice somehow finding the authority to make men stand who had every reason to run. Together, hit it together, don't let it take you one at a time. Seneca worked the edges of it, his shotgun roaring into the joints in the visor and the places where even that armor was thinnest, not to kill, for he could not kill it, but to blind it and hound it and keep it turning, keep it from settling its whole terrible focus on any one soul long enough to end them. Oban did the same with his revolver as he got back to his feet. They fought it the way men fight a fire, giving ground and closing again, everyone bleeding for every second, and the seconds were bought with blood, and still it would not go down. Still it came on, and Seneca, roaring and firing and falling back, felt the knowledge rising in him that this was not enough, that all their courage bound together was not enough, that in another minute or two of this it would simply have killed them all. It was one of Wen's men who found the answer and paid for it. Seneca never learned his name until afterward. He was a breacher of the ship's own team, and in the chaos and the smoke, he did the one thing that a mortal man might do against such a foe. He got behind it. While the giant's whole attention was fixed forward on Oban's shield and Seneca's guns, the man slipped around into its blind and unregarded rear, and he took from his belt a crack grenade, a small fierce charge made for the cracking of armor and the breaking of doors. And he reached up and jammed it into the one place on all that dreadful warplate where it might do harm, the seam between the great backpack and the armor of the back, where the sealed plates met and left, for the span of a hand, a vulnerable gap. And then, because he was a good soldier even in the last second of his life, he thought of the others before himself. Down! He bellowed over all the noise, so that his own comrades might not be caught in the blast he was about to loose. Get down! The Marine heard him. Of course it heard him. It heard everything. It turned faster than anything so vast had any right to turn, and it killed him. One blow, as it had killed all the others. The man dead before the warning had finished leaving his mouth. But he had already set the grenade, and the setting of it could not be unmade, and in the same half instant that the giant struck him down, the crack charge detonated against its back. The blast wrapped the Marine in fire and smoke. It did not kill it. Seneca saw the great shape still standing in the roiling murk, but it staggered it at last, and better than staggered it, it blinded it, filling the air around its helm with smoke from the backpack's damaged power core. For the first time in that whole terrible dance, the giant did not know where its foes were. The grenade had ruined the beast's pack and blasted shards of ceramite into the creature's back through the seam in the armor. It swung about, wild now, sightless, its certainty gone. And that was the opening, the only one they would get. Bought with a good man's life, not 30 seconds spent. They took it together, because together was the only way anything could be taken from such a thing. Every gun that could still be brought to bear was brought to bear at once, into the smoke, into the wound the grenade had torn, into the blinded giant all at the same moment. And this time, at last, with its armor breached and its sight stolen, and every desperate soul in that room firing into the same ruined place the grenade had made for them. It was enough. The Marine came down. It came down slowly, and it came down fighting, still trying to reach them even as it fell, and it was a long and dreadful while, dying even then. But it died. The giant died on the deck of the wardroom junction, and it took the whole of them together and one man's life freely given to make it so. Seneca noted, in the settled cold place behind his sternum, that he had not spent the melter charge. It had been in his mind to use it. Even the cutter would have opened that armor like a tin of rations. But the fight had never given him the room or the moment, and the grenade had done the work instead. And so the melter remained upon his back, its fuel unspent. Some quiet instinct, the same that had made him carry cord and strap against a need not yet known, told him he would be glad of that before the night was done. He did not yet know how glad he would be, nor what it would cost him, nor which of them the cost would fall upon. He only knew to keep it, and so he kept it. When it was over, the wardroom junction was a slaughterhouse. Seneca looked upon it and made himself look, because someone should, because the dead deserve at the least to be seen. Wen's fine team, which had been holding so well when the two of them arrived, was all but gone. Scarcely 3 of the dozen still stood, and they stood swaying, grey-faced, hollowed out by what they had lived through. The young officer himself yet lived, which was something, and the breacher who had killed the giant lay where he had fallen, in the thinning smoke near the thing he had slain. And Seneca went to him and looked at him and set his name, once he had learnt it, down in the long account he carried, alongside the green boys of the corridor and all the others, the growing ledger of the cost of that night. The 3 of Wen's men who could still walk fell in with Oban and Seneca. Then, without much needing to be said, the way survivors gather to the strongest thing left standing. Seneca marked their faces. He then looked to the fallen marine and wondered how many more of them were loose aboard the ship tonight. There was no time to answer the question, and perhaps that was a mercy. For even as they stood among the dead and gathered themselves, Seneca felt the deck speak to him again, the thrum, the deep, patient heartbeat of the navigator's labor. And it was stronger now than it had been in the corridor, more insistent, climbing by slow degrees towards some fullness still hours off. The ship was working, the road was being cut. Hold long enough, and it would end. And from behind them, back the way they had come, rolling up through the wreckage-choked corridors of the forward decks, there came again that long, droning note of brass, the horn of the tithe, sounding out across the ship. But it was not one horn now, it was many, answering one another through the hull, and Seneca had already learned enough of that dreadful music to know what it meant. It was the sound of a fresh assault gathering itself. It was the enemy, massing for another push, coming on again behind them, even as the spire still lay ahead. Oban lowered his shield a moment and looked at Seneca, and said only, "We should move." Seneca drew his breath. "Yes," he said, "we should." Beyond the wardroom junction, the way toward the spire climbed, by broad shallow stairs and half flights, toward a great landing where several passages met before the final approach to the astropathic gallery. And it was here, in this wide place of crossing ways, that Seneca came upon the thing that he would carry longest of all the things he carried out of that night. He heard it before he saw it, and what he heard was a voice raised in prayer. It was not a screaming voice, nor a mad one. Amid all the howling and the horns and the roar of guns that had filled the forward decks for what felt now like half a lifetime, here was a single human voice, speaking words of comfort and defiance, steady and unbroken. And the sound of it stopped Seneca in his tracks more surely than any enemy could have done. He came up onto the landing, and he saw her. A woman in the robes of a confessor of the ministorum, not young, her vestments torn, and her face streaked with soot and blood not her own, standing before a huddled knot of perhaps 30 souls, Refugees, ordinary people, mothers with children clutched against them, and old men, and the sick from the lower holds, and holding them together by nothing in all the world but the sheer unbending force of her own will, and the words she would not stop speaking. She had placed herself between them and the dark, this one woman, and she was preaching to them of the Emperor's love, and the certainty of deliverance, in a voice that did not so much as tremble. And because she did not break, they did not break. And Seneca understood that she was the only thing keeping 30 terrified people from dissolving into a screaming rout that the enemy would harvest at its leisure. Her name, he would learn, was Elspeth. She had gathered these people out of the chaos of the holds and led them up through the fighting toward the one hope she knew of. And now she had brought them here, to this landing, and here they were trapped. For every way off that landing had been cut. Only the passage that Oban and Seneca themselves were traveling, the way onwards toward the gallery and the spire, remained open. And behind the huddled civilians, back the way they had come, the sounds of pursuit were rising. The enemy was coming up after them. The horn had sounded a fresh push, and the push was here, and it was climbing toward this landing full of helpless people with knives and pipes and blood-marked brows. And so Seneca and Oban were faced, in that moment, with the hardest choice of all the hard choices of that night. They could hold the one open way. That much was in their power. That was the very thing they were made for. Oban could plant his shield in the mouth of the passage and hold it, as he had held the cordon corridor. And behind that shield the civilians could pour through to relative safety, out of the trap and onwards toward the gallery. But every heartbeat that the way stood open for the stragglers to reach it was a heartbeat that the enemy drew nearer. And there would come a moment. Seneca knew it, and he knew that Oban knew it. And worst of all, he suspected the confessor knew it too, when the way could be held open no longer, when to keep it open one instant more would be to lose everything. The shield and the breaches, and the mission, and the spire, and the whole ship, and the fleet behind it. There would come a moment when the door had to close, and it would close with people still on the wrong side of it. They did what could be done. Oban set his shield in the passage mouth and became the doorway once again, and Seneca stood at the hatch controls and worked the mechanism and called to the fleeing people, "Come, come this way, run." And Elspeth turned her flock toward the one open way and drove them through it with her voice, still preaching, still unbroken, standing at the rear of them to push the last and slowest onwards. They came through in a stumbling, terrified stream. The children first, handed forward over the heads of the crowd, then the mothers, then the old, then the sick and the lame who could barely move at all. And behind them, up the stairs and onto the landing, red in the red light, the enemy came. And the moment came, as Seneca had known it would. There were still people on the landing when the enemy reached it, not many, a handful, the very last and slowest of them, and Elspeth among them at the rear. And the cultists were among these last stragglers now, in among them. And if Seneca held the hatch open one breath longer to let them through, he would let the enemy through with them, into the passage, past the shield, and it would all be for nothing. He knew it in the cold, settled place where he did his truest thinking. He looked in that final instant for the confessor. If the emperor were kind, he would see her close enough to make it through, and what he saw instead was Elspeth planting her own feet on the landing amid the last of her people, turning to face the tide that was breaking over them, putting herself and her unbending will between the enemy and the hatch, to buy the stragglers the last few steps. She was not going to come through. She had chosen the landing. She looked across the closing gap, and she met Seneca's eyes, once, and there was no fear in her face, and no reproach, only a kind of fierce and terrible peace. And her lips were still moving in prayer. Seneca closed the hatch. He would carry the sound of it forever, the heavy final boom of the great door seating itself, and the knowledge of what remained on the other side of it. A few made it through in that last instant, 3 or 4 souls flung forward through the narrowing gap by the confessor's own hands. The rest did not. Elspeth did not. The hatch came down between the saved and the lost, as such doors always must in the end, and it fell to Seneca's hand to bring it down. And he brought it down, because that was the price of getting anyone through at all, and because the ship and the fleet and the 200,000 were counting on the door being closed. There was no time to grieve her, and so Seneca did not then. But as they went, in a shadowed side passage off the landing, they came upon a thing that Seneca would remember alongside the confessor, though for a wholly different reason, and that gave him, even in the midst of all that horror, a fresh and colder kind of fear. There was a man in that side passage, alone. He wore the uniform of a ship's armsman, an Attican like the refugees, one of their own, but he was not fighting for the ship, and he was not fleeing, and he had not turned to chaos in the way the cultists had turned, mouthing its prayers and wearing its star. He was doing something worse, in its way and stranger. He was crouched over the bodies of the slain, the enemy's dead and the ship's dead alike. It made no difference to him. And he was making of them a kind of offering, an ordering of the dead into shapes that Seneca's eye refused to hold, muttering to himself all the while, feeding something in the dark with the only thing the dark ever wants. He had not gone over to the enemy. He had simply been broken by the night into something that mirrored the enemy, that had arrived at the enemy's own red devotion by its own private road of horror and grief. He looked up as they passed, and his eyes were not mad, which was the worst of it. They were quite clear, quite aware, and they looked at Seneca with a kind of dreadful invitation, as if to say, "You see how it is. You see what the night truly is. Come and see it too." Seneca did not answer that invitation, and neither did Oban. They did not fire on the man, for he made no move toward them, and there was killing enough that night without adding his. They only looked at him and looked away, and went on, and left him to his terrible communion in the dark. But Seneca understood what he had been shown. He understood that the red-handed thing that had taken the cultists and the traitors was not something wholly other, not a foreign horror that could touch only foreign souls. It was a door that stood open at the bottom of every frightened, grieving, exhausted heart, and a man had only to stop holding it shut. That was what the red one was, the broken armsman in the side passage. He was a mirror. He was what any of them could become, what Seneca himself could become, or Oban, if ever they set down the small, unglamorous disciplines by which men remained men, the counting, the held breath, the marking of faces, the closing of the door with your own hand, because it had to be closed. It was those small things Seneca understood, and only those that stood between a man and the crouching thing in the dark. Ahead of them now the passage opened at last toward the astropathic gallery, and beyond the gallery Seneca could see it now, could see the great sealed doors of it rising in the distance. Lay the spire itself, the navigator, the end of the whole desperate road. They were close. They were closer than they had any right to be, given the circumstances, and the thrum beneath their feet had climbed higher still, deeper and more urgent. The navigator's labor building toward its distant fullness, so that hope, absurd and unlooked for, stirred in Seneca's chest for the first time since the cards had scattered on the table. It was then that he felt the deck carry another tread to him from behind, and knew that hope had come too soon. He turned, back down the passage, where it opened onto the ruined landing they had just quit. Something was coming. It came alone, and it came without haste, not charging, not yet, but walking, a single vast silhouette advancing through the smoke with a slow and dreadful certainty that was somehow more terrible than any charge could have been. The certainty of a thing that has never once in its existence been stopped by anything, and does not imagine that it is about to be. It was armored like the raider had been armored, in the deep dried red, but where the raider had moved with a cold and patient grace, this thing moved with something else, something worse, a coiled and trembling eagerness, a hunger held on a fraying leash. Seneca had thought the giant in the junction was the worst the night could show him. He saw now that he had been wrong. There was a thing worse than a Chaos Space Marine, and it was a Chaos Space Marine that had given itself wholly and forever to the god of slaughter, and burned away everything else, until nothing remained but the wanting of blood. The berserker came on toward them through the smoke, unhurried, unstoppable, and the spire doors were still so very far away. The astropathic gallery was the strangest place in the ship, and Seneca had never liked to pass through it even in gentler days. It was a great vaulted hall, high and long and echoing, and along its upper reaches, screened behind lattices of iron and shadow and light, scattering through stained glass, sat the astropathic choir at its endless work, the blind psychers whose bound minds carried the ship's word across the void. A man could not see them, passing from below, but he could feel them, and that was the trouble. The air of the gallery crawled. There was a pressure in it that had nothing to do with the body, a bleeding of the mind's own private world out into the open, so that a man walking through felt his skin prickle, and his thoughts grow slippery and strange, felt half-heard whispers at the edge of his hearing, and half-seen movements at the edge of his sight, none of which were there. It was into this place, this high, echoing hall, where the veil between the seen and the unseen wore thinnest, that the berserker ran them down. And run them down it did, for a thing like that could not be outrun and would not be reasoned with, and had no interest in anything under all the stars but the reaching of them. It had walked on the landing, now with clear ground before it, and its prey in sight. It charged. It came down the length of the gallery like a landslide given purpose, faster than anything so vast had any right to move, and it came with a sound, a rising howl of pure and wordless want that mingled with the psychic bleed of the choir, until Seneca could not have said which of the horrors crawling over him came from the thing and which from the air itself. There was no squad to help them now. Against the raider in the junction, they had had Wen and his breachers, a dozen good guns to whittle and distract and bind together into something that could bleed the giant down. Here, there was almost no one. The few civilians they had saved had fled onwards toward the doors. The 2 or 3 of Wen's men who yet lived were with the civilians and had no intention of coming back. There was Oban, and there was Seneca, and there was the thing coming down the hall, and that was the whole of the account. 2 men, this was theirs to do alone or not at all. Upon seeing the thing, they had already spread out, using the space of the hall to their advantage. Oban, being the berserker's first target, turned and did the only thing he knew how to do, to buy some time for Seneca to think, and because it was the only thing there was to do, and it very nearly ended him. He set his shield and braced to take the charge, looking to move slightly out of the way at the moment of impact, like a matador. He braced in the same way he had taken 1,000 charges, trusting the great scarred slab of plasteel and the 10 years of knowing how to stand behind it. But there is no standing behind anything in the path of a Khorne berserker at the height of its charge. The thing struck the shield, and the shield did not stop it, did not slow it, and did not so much as check it. It simply drove through and the impact, despite Oban's effort to move to the side, flung him from his feet and hurled him the length of half the gallery to crash against the iron latticework and lie still. For one endless instant, Seneca thought his friend was dead, thought that 10 years had ended in a single blow in a hall full of whispering ghosts, and something in his chest went white and silent at the thought. Then Oban stirred and groaned and began, dazed and slow, to rise. And Seneca understood in the same instant 2 things. That the shield that was so vital to the pair's tactics could not save them here, and that if this thing were to be stopped at all, it would not be stopped by strength, for they had no strength that meant anything to it. It would have to be stopped by cunning. It would have to be tricked. Seneca's mind had been looking for a solution the moment the two spread out into the space, and he thought of it, because that was the thing Seneca could do that no one else aboard that ship could do. He could look at a hopeless piece of ground and a hopeless moment, and see, in one cold, clear sweep, the single hidden shape of a way through. The melter charge he had carried unspent out of the junction, which some quiet instinct had told him to keep. If he could set it on the deck, and if he could bring the berserker to stand upon that spot for even a single instant, the fury would do to it what no gun and no shield and no strength of theirs could hope to do. But he could not set it while the thing was watching him, and he could not stop and kneel and work with the berserker bearing down, for it would be upon him before the charge was placed. So he did a terrible thing, a thing that took more nerve than any charge or any stand. He let it think it had already won. The berserker still had his eyes fixed on Oban, prowling him in a semicircle like a panther might circle prey, seeing to take pleasure in his struggle to regain his footing. Seneca was watching while, at the same time, quickly arming the melter. Speed was paramount, and it was becoming more so now that the berserker had decided to close in on Oban. With the remote detonation function set and the final click of the arming switch clacking into place, Seneca had his plan and loaded a slug into the chamber of his shotgun. He crouched as the enemy looked towards his friend and shot. The slug slapped against the berserker's rear plate between the shoulder blades. It wheeled from the broken shape of Oban and fixed its howling attention upon Seneca, the more imminent threat and, being the healthier of the 2 men, the more interesting challenge. It charged him from across the vaulted room. Seneca, at this charge, turned and ran, trying to look as terrified as he possibly could. Part way through his turn, he fell in his terror, went down hard, sprawling, as though the thing's mere approach had felled him, as though he had stumbled in his terror and lost his feet and lay helpless and finished on the deck. It was the most convincing thing he ever did, because it was 3/4 true. He was terrified, and his body did want to fall, and he had only to stop holding it up and let it do the thing it longed to do. And a berserker, for all its speed and all its fury, is a thing of appetite and not of thought. It saw its prey go down, and helpless and scrambling, and some part of its ruined mind savored the killing to come, and it did not wonder why the fallen man's hands were busy at the deck beneath him. For beneath the cover of his own body, Seneca had placed the melter charge against the plating, swift and sure, and there was no breath for the settling breath now, no time and no room for the small ritual that had steadied him before every labor of his life. There was only the falling and the setting and the flicking open of the little handheld switch that would fire it. After this, Seneca continued to scramble away from his enemy, trying to put as much distance between himself and the melter as possible. Seeing that his prey was still actively trying to flee, the berserker increased the pace of its charge. Seneca, as far away as his legs could carry him, waited until the creature was as close to the explosive as he dared, and he pressed the handheld detonator until the switch gave way, with a satisfying click. The world turned to white fire and a heat like the opening of a furnace door, and the berserker was engulfed. It was enough. The cutter's fury tore into the thing and killed it, killed even that, and unmade the horror that no gun they had could touch. But the timing that had been good was not perfect, and in war, the difference between good and perfect is written in men's bodies. The charge did not drop the thing clean where it stood. It had cut away most of the lower body of the traitor and the majority of the left-hand side, but it did not die instantly, the power armor doing an immaculate job of protecting some of its body. But it knew it was dying, and in the last moments it hurled the great bladed weapon at Seneca. As fast as Seneca reacted, it was not fast enough, and the weapon caught an arm that was trailing as his body was hurled to one side. It took his right forearm, took it below the elbow, and tore it away. And for the first time in all that night, for the first time perhaps in all his life, Seneca could not find his breath. It was not the pain, though the pain was a white and enormous thing. It was that the breath itself would not come. The small, settled, steadying breath that had been his whole life's discipline, the drawing in and holding that had carried him through every door and every charge and every terror of that endless night, deserted him now when he reached for it, and he lay on the shuddering deck with his arm gone and his breath gone with it, and something rising in him that was very close to the end of everything. Then Oban was there. He came across the gallery at a stumbling run, careless of the whispering dark and the choir's crawling bleed, and he went down on his knees at Seneca's side, and he did not waste a single word. There was no need for words. There had never been any need of words between them, and there was less than none now. But there passed between them in that moment, in the way Oban's hands went to the ruined arm, and the way Seneca's eyes found his friend's face, a thing that had lain unspoken beneath everything the two of them had ever done together. There was an old debt, the oldest debt, from a war years gone and a world away, when Oban had lain broken and dying, and Seneca had come back for him through fire that should have killed them both, and had carried him out, and had never once asked to be thanked. Oban had carried that debt in silence for 10 years. He paid it now, wordlessly, on his knees in a whispering hall, with his hands. And Seneca's own kit saved his life, as some quiet instinct had always meant it to. It was Oban's hands that did the work, but it was Seneca's foresight that had made the work possible. Fortunately, the melter charge had superheated most of the metal it had come into contact with, including the berserker's blade, meaning that the wound had mostly cauterized itself. The medkit did the rest of the work, with its fast-acting clotting agent packed now into the places of raw ruin of the stump, and the cord and the strong strap wound tight and carried all this way against a need not yet known, lashed now below the elbow, hard and tight, so that the remaining bleeding slowed and stopped. He kept the elbow. That would matter. Oban's swift hands had bound the strap below the joint and not above, leaving him the elbow. But that was for later. For now, there was only the stopping of the blood and the packing of the wound, and the slow return, at long and ragged last, of Seneca's breath. Not the settled, steadying breath of his discipline, which would not come back to him for a long while yet, but a rough, torn, gasping breath that was at least the breath of a man who was going to live. They were wrecked, the two of them, and they both knew it. The melter was spent. Seneca's great trick was played and could not be played again. They were running low on ammo. Oban's ribs were likely broken, and Seneca had one hand now, only the one, and a shotgun that wanted two, and a body drained white and faint with shock and loss. Two ruined men at the end of a long night's ruin. And they were not even at the doors yet. Oban got an arm under him and lifted him, and together they went the last of the way down the whispering gallery, and came out at last before the great sealed blast doors of the navigator's spire, the end of the road, the place they had bled the whole night through to reach. And there they stopped, and looked back across the open vaulted hall they had just crossed, and looked at what was gathered before those doors, and saw the full scale of the thing that was still, even now, even after everything, coming for them. Everything the long night had taught them came down in the end to this one place, and it is fitting to tell it plainly, for a last stand asks no ornament of the telling. It is only men, and a door, and the dark coming on. The ground was this. Before the great blast doors of the spire there was a broad half-circle of open decking, and into it there opened 3 ways. The main approach, wide and straight, up which the 2 of them had just come, and by which the bulk of any assault must surely arrive, and 2 lesser service hatches, one to either side, narrow throats by which a cunning foe might slip around to take a defender in the flank. At their backs stood the doors themselves, sealed and immovable, the last barrier between the enemy and the navigator, which meant there was no falling back, nowhere further to go. This was the last ground. Beyond it there was only the thing they were dying to protect, and through a gap in those doors, where the great valves did not quite seat flush against one another, Seneca saw him. He had never seen a navigator before, not truly while they work, and he saw one now. Masenomar Vast, seated in the heart of his sanctum, amid a tangle of arcane instruments and murmuring servitors, his ordinary eyes closed, and the third eye in his brow open wide, that dread and blessed eye that saw the roads of the warp, and utterly, wholly, terribly absorbed. He did not turn, through all of it, through the fighting at his very doorstep, through the deaths of the men bleeding out to keep him alive. The navigator never once turned his head, never gave any sign that he knew or cared that anyone was there at all. And Seneca understood that this was right. This was as it had to be. Vast could not help them. His whole self was bent to the cutting of the road, and the instant he turned from it to acknowledge them, they would all be lost together. And they could not help him, save by dying in the doorway. Each of them was alone with his own labor, the navigator with his road, and the breachers with their door. And the 2 labors could not touch, and needed not to. Each simply held. They made their dispositions quickly, because there was no time, and because they both already knew what must be done. Seneca could not fight as he had fought. There was no use pretending otherwise. He was faint, white with shock, and the loss of blood, and of the arm itself. And the shotgun, his loud and final friend of 100 corridors, was a weapon that wanted 2 hands, and he had only one. He was, for the close and brutal work he had done all his life, all but useless now, and to a lesser man, that knowledge might have been the end of his usefulness altogether. But Oban put the revolver in his hand. It was the right weapon, the only weapon, for a one-armed man who could still think and still aim. 6 rounds. Oban also gave Seneca his ammo pouch, though reloading would be an interesting task. It was a weapon that asked nothing of a man, but a steady eye and a cool head, and the willingness to make every single shot a decision. And those things Seneca still had, and would have to the last. Oban set him behind cover, a jut of the doorway's frame where he could work the revolver upon the flanking hatches and the edges of the press, and said nothing about it, and Seneca said nothing back, and the whole exchange of the thing was one look, and the weight of the gun settling into his hand. Survivors from the earlier fights were here also, Wen's men from the fight with the Chaos Space Marine had set up behind the cover of metal storage containers. Other men from other fights were here as well, likely converging on this place as a location of importance. Their presence was welcome. Oban would take the doorway itself. Of course he would. Where else would Oban stand but in the door? He was, and had always been, the doorway in the shape of a man. And now he set his great scarred shield across the main approach, deployed its stands so that it would sit upright unassisted, and readied Seneca's shotgun, and became once more the thing that would not move. And then the enemy came, and the last stand began. They came in waves, and they were cultists now in the main. The trained traitors and the giants seemed spent or drawn away elsewhere, and what broke upon the doors was the ragged tide of the star-marked, the broken Attican souls, whom hunger and terror had delivered to the Red God. They came up the main approach into Oban's shield and Oban's shotgun, and died there. And when they realized that the frontal assault was not working, they tried the service hatches, slipping through the narrow throats to left and right. And there Seneca met them, from his cover, with the speech of the revolver. One round, and a man fell in the left-hand hatch. Another, and a man fell in the right. He did not waste them. He could not. He had 6, and then the patient one-handed labor of reloading, holding the revolver barrel under the pit of his ruined arm, so that the working hand could chamber more rounds. And then 6 more, and everyone had to count. He made everyone count, and through all of it, over the roar and the screaming and the droning horns, Oban counted. Seneca had heard that low murmur all his life, over card tables and in corridors, and in the mouths of a dozen desperate fights, and never once had it faltered. It was the sound of Oban's whole self, the discipline by which he held the chaos of the world at bay, the tally he kept against a universe that kept no tally of him. He counted his rounds, and he counted the enemy, and he counted the seconds, and the doors, and the falling, and the standing, steady and unbroken. And so long as that murmur went on, Seneca knew, in some deep place beneath thought, that things were bad, but not yet lost, that his friend was still his friend, and still counting, and still holding the door. One of Wen's men, who had come this far, fell in that grinding. They fought well at the last, better than they perhaps had known they could. The night had made soldiers of them at the very end of it. One fell at the right-hand hatch, and the hatch after that was Seneca's alone to hold. Later another fell in the main approach beside Oban, and the shield's flank was barer for it. The little band that had gathered through the long night's journey, the faces Seneca had marked and carried, the survivors of the junction, the few saved from the landing who had found a weapon and turned to fight. They went out like candles in a wind, one, and then another, and then another, until the half-circle of decking before the doors held far fewer living than it had, and the cover shrank around the 2 of them as they fell back, and the dead lay thick where the living had stood. And then Oban stopped counting. Seneca fired his last round and did not reach for another, and turned his greying sight toward the doorway to find his friend. There were no more enemy to fire at, simply the piled dead and the remaining defenders holding their breath. And in that same instant, up through the ruined deck beneath them both, through the bodies and the blood and the bones of the dying ship, there came a new thing, not the horn, not the screaming, but the thrum, the navigator's thrum, the deep heartbeat that had followed them all the long night through, that had been building and building beneath their feet. Through every fight and every death since the cordon corridor. It had been a murmur once, faint as a thing half imagined. It had grown through the night to a steady, insistent pulse. And now, all at once, it was neither murmur nor pulse, but a rising scream, a vast climbing note that came up through the whole substance of the ship and into their bodies and their teeth. and the marrow of their bones, higher and higher, towards some unbearable fullness that could mean only one thing. The road was cut. The navigator had done it. After all the hours and all the dying, the thing they had bled to make possible was here at last, rising to its terrible crescendo in the deck beneath the doors. Translation was here. The translation, when it came gently, or if not gently, then at least not cruelly, which is as much as anyone aboard a ship of the warp may ever hope for. Seneca felt it take the ship the way he felt all her doings, up through the deck and into the bones of him. But this was no violence, no folding horror pressed against the hull. It was a great settling, rather a vast easing, as of a burden long carried and set down at last. The rising scream of the navigator's labor reached its unbearable crest, and then broke and passed, and gave way all at once to a stillness so complete that for a moment Seneca thought he had gone deaf, until he understood that the silence was real, that the ship had simply ceased her long agony of transit and come, after days and a night of blood, to rest in ordinary space. The lumens steadied, the wrongness went out of the air. Somewhere far below, a reactor that had labored to the edge of failing found its rhythm again and held it. And the Mater Dolorosa, that old and patient mother of sorrows, drifted out of the dark into the light of a common yellow sun. They had made it, against everything, against the horn and the star, and the giants in the red armor, against the mathematics of the night that had said so plainly that they would not. They had made it. The navigator had cut his road true, and the road had led here, to this sector and this sun, and in the near distance, swelling slowly in the great forward viewports as the ship came about, hung the muster world of Sanctorum Ves. It was no fair world to look upon. Seneca, half carried to a viewport by Oban in the quiet after, gazed out at it and saw a grey and armoured planet girdled in the steel of 100 orbital docks, ringed about with the guns of the Imperial Navy, grim and grinding and joyless as everything the Imperium built for the making of war. It was not a beautiful thing, but it was ours. Its guns were our guns, and they were pointed outward. At the dark they had just come through, and behind their shelter there was no horn, and no star daubed in blood, and no red tide climbing up out of the holds. There was only the long, hard business of survival, of labor and conscription, and the sorting of the living, and to men who had spent the night learning exactly what the alternative looked like, that grim safety seemed just then very nearly like grace. And they were not the only ones who had come through. One by one, in the hours that followed, the ships of the little fleet translated in after their flagship, dropping out of the warp in her wake like ducklings following the mother across a pond. The pilgrim transports, thin-hulled and overladen, and blessedly whole. The great lifter with the food and the water plant that would keep them all alive. The mismatched haulers, and last of all, battered near to death, but still under power. The lone escort that had sold itself so dearly to keep the enemy's larger ships off the transports, and had gone silent on the Vox, and had been mourned already by everyone who heard that silence. And here it was, alive, limping home. 9 ships had fled the death of Attica Secundus. 9 ships came to anchor in the shadow of Sanctorum Ves. Not one had been lost to the sea. 210,000 souls, the remnant of billions, yes. And Seneca would never let himself forget the billions, but 210,000 who yet drew breath, who would make landfall, who would live. And every one of them carried through the last and worst night of that long flight, because a handful of tired men had stood in a doorway and refused to let the dark come through. For they had not been alone at the last, Seneca and Oban. When the fighting ended and the quiet came, There were others still standing in the ruined half-circle before the spire doors. Not many, a bare handful, but standing. One of Wen's breachers who had lived through it all against every likelihood. A pair of the ship's own armsmen who had rallied to the sound of the guns. One of the refugees saved from the landing. A broad-shouldered hab worker who had taken up a fallen weapon and would not put it down until the end. A handful of the living propping one another up amid the fallen. They had held the door together, these few, and together they had lived, and there is a quiet that settles over men who have survived a thing they had all privately decided they would not. A wordless, wondering quiet, in which each looks at the other's faces, as though not quite believing them to be real. No one cheered, they only stood and breathed and were alive together. And that was enough, and more than enough. The doors behind them never opened. Maseno Vast did not come out to look upon the men who had died for him, and Seneca found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not resent it. The navigator had done his labor, the greatest labor of all, and by it the whole fleet lived. If the price of that was that he would never know their names, nor the shape of what they had suffered at his threshold, then that was a fair enough division of the night's burdens. Each had held his own door. Vast had held the road, and they had held the spire, and between the two of them the ship had come home. By and by the relief came, medici teams pushing up through the cleared decks at last, and armsmen of the ship's reserve, and the machinery of a vessel, remembering how to be a vessel again, rather than a battlefield. Gentle hands took Seneca's weight from Oban, and laid him on a proper stretcher, and looked at the strapped ruin of his arm, and told him, in the careful voices such men use, that he had done exactly the right things, that the strap below the elbow and the clotting agent packed into the wound had saved not only his life, but the joint itself, that he would keep the elbow, and in time would likely be fitted with an augmetic, and be, if not the man he had been, then a man still, and a whole one after his fashion. Seneca heard all this from a great and floating distance, and did not much attend to it. He was looking at Oban. His friend stood over the stretcher, refusing to be moved along, his great scarred shield at last set down and leaning against the spire doors where he had planted it 100 times that night. He looked ruined and ancient and utterly spent. But there was something in his face that Seneca had not seen in a long while, a kind of ease, a loosening of the perpetual watchfulness that Oban wore the way other men wore their skin. The counting was done. There was nothing left to count, and for once, the nothing was a mercy rather than a dread. "We're even now," Oban said. It was said low and quietly, and for Seneca alone, and Seneca understood every fathom of what lay beneath it, the old debt from the old war, the coming back through the fire that neither of them had spoken of in all the years between, the whole vast unpayable thing that Oban had carried in silence and had paid at last, on his knees in a whispering gallery, with his hands. 3 words, no more. Seneca did not answer him in words. There were none in him equal to it. But he felt something come loose in his chest, some knot drawn tight since the moment on the gallery deck when the arm was torn away and his breath had deserted him, the settled, steadying breath, the discipline of his whole life, that had not come back to him through all the last stand at the doors, that he had fought the entire final battle without. He felt it stir now, here in the light of a common sun, with his friend beside him, and the fleet come safe to anchor, and the long night finished at last. And Seneca drew a breath. It came slow, and it came whole, and it came all the way down to the bottom of him, the way it was meant to. The first true breath he had taken since the gallery, since the arm, since the world folded. A breath drawn aboard a ship that lived, by a man who lived, beneath the guns of a world that would shelter them. Above them, through the forward ports, Sanctorum Ves turned slowly in the light, grey and grim and safe. The dark was behind them. The fleet was home. They had held. They had come through. And every soul aboard those 9 battered ships would live to see the morning, because when the night was at its worst, and the door was all there was, a few tired men had stood in it and would not fall.